Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, called it a budget for a new era delivered in challenging times. He was referring, of course, to the coronavirus outbreak, and there were a raft of measures designed to help both the NHS, business and its workers get through the emergency. He set aside £12 billion to tackle the disease and its effects on our lives and the economy. There are changes to sick pay rules and access to benefits for the self-employed. He said the NHS would get whatever it needs, whatever it costs. This is the first budget since Britain left the EU, and the Chancellor outlined a 5-year public spending boost for infrastructure on a scale not seen for nearly 30 years. Hundreds of billions will be spent on roads, rail, broadband and housing. The budget followed an emergency cut in interest rates this morning. The Bank of England took the rate from 0.75% down to 0.25%, taking borrowing costs back down to the lowest level in history. Tonight we will look at where the money is coming from and how it's going to be spent. But first, let's join our political editor Laura Koonsberg on the first budget of the Johnson government. Laura.
George, this is a very significant day. It's the first budget since we left the European Union, the first budget since the general election. That changed the landscape. But with the advance of coronavirus, it is not the budget that anybody in government would have imagined or predicted just a few short weeks ago. And it is not the budget that any Conservative would have expected a few short years ago. Because barely a month into the job, the new Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, promised to spend big and borrow big too. And what he put forward today represents a very big change for us all.
What might be an emergency for our health could be an emergency for the economy.
An economic shock that could prove large and sharp.
Ministers want to slow the spread of the virus.
Do you need to self-isolate?
And limit the ill effects on how the country makes its living. The new man at number 11 clutching what felt like an emergency budget. A job that's become more daunting every single one of the 27 days that he's been in charge. With more than 450 people with coronavirus now, even a couple in Westminster.
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Number 1 on the Chancellor's list was clear.
We will get through this together. The British people may be worried, but they are not daunted. We will protect our country and our people. We will rise to this challenge. For a period, it's going to be tough, but I'm confident that our economic performance will recover.
To get to the other side, £12 billion to start with for public services and private business. Spending on a scale worth listening to.
First, whatever extra resources our NHS needs to cope with coronavirus, it will get. Whether it's millions of pounds or billions of pounds, whatever it needs, whatever it costs, we stand behind our NHS.
He promised cash, grants, even suspending business taxes for some small firms.
If people fall ill or can't work, we must support their finances. We'll make sure that our safety net remains strong enough to fall back on. For businesses with fewer than 250 employees, I have decided that the cost of providing statutory sick pay to any employee off work due to coronavirus will, for up to 14 days, be refunded by the government in full.
Beyond the immediate emergency, the task was also to keep the promises of the Tory manifesto, to build, to restore public bricks and mortar right around the country. Huge spending on roads, rail, science and housing.
We need to build the infrastructure that will lay the foundations for a new century of prosperity. We need to grab the opportunity to upgrade, to improve, to enhance, to level up. That starts today with the next part of our plan as we get Britain building.
A record splurge paid for by running up a huge national overdraft.
Of a government that gets things done, creating jobs.
Impossible to imagine Tories cheering a budget like this a few years ago.
A people's budget from a people's government, and I commend it to this House.
A new Chancellor fixing his place alongside the Prime Minister a new era too. So would there be a new response from Labour?
The Chancellor shows not some, a lot of brass neck when he boasts that measures to deal with coronavirus are only possible because of his party's management of the economy. This is a budget which has an admission of failure, an admission that austerity has been a failed experiment. It didn't solve our economic problems, but made them worse, that held back our own recovery and failed even in its own terms.
Opposition reminders the Tories have been in charge for nearly a decade.
This Tory government has failed to level up for anyone, anywhere. And they can't be allowed to hide from these facts, just as they can't be allowed to hide from their legacy.
And a note of caution from a familiar face.
Prudent management of the public finances is one of the USPs of the Conservative Party. Government doesn't have any money of its own, it is spending other people's money. And we owe it to them to only take as much as we need and to spend it wisely.
But conventional Tory wisdom shifted here today. Big spending and big borrowing now the direction. Yet the government may be forced to change much further to cope with a virus well beyond its control. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
So the Chancellor dubbed today's budget as the biggest spending boost to the economy in a generation. But the money, hundreds of billions in all, has to come from somewhere, and that might mean much higher borrowing. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity explains.
Today's budget is a financial giveaway from the government to the rest of the economy on a scale unseen since 1992. £30 billion in higher spending and tax changes this year, nearly a third of it anticipated in November's spending review. Over the next 5 years, an extra £175 billion and an emergency interest rate cut of 0.5 percentage point. All to tackle an economic shock that policymakers fear could be large and sharp and stop it turning into something worse.
There is no reason for this shock to turn into the experience of 2008, a virtual lost decade in a number of economies, if we handle it well.
Because the effects of the coronavirus, keeping people away from work and disrupting supplies, will be temporary, so are many of the emergency measures, such as suspending business rates for struggling retailers and hotel owners. But others are more permanent, such as cutting national insurance for the lowest paid. As previous Conservative chancellors kept saying, there's no magic money tree. Rishi Sunak is now proposing to spend way more than his income, so he has to borrow. These bars show you how much the government was expected to borrow just 3 months ago. But then look at these bars. They show what he'd now have to borrow, and that's before the coronavirus measures. Then take a look at this one. This yellow line indicates that borrowing was expected to fall soon. The red line shows that it's expected to go much higher before later falling back. Again, that's before taking into account the coronavirus measures. The official independent forecaster says all the extra government borrowing and spending will stimulate the economy, boosting productivity and growth, at least in the near future.
When the government is pumping more spending power into the economy, you would expect activity to pick up, but that's only likely to be a temporary effect. Over the medium term, we think that the policy measures announced in this budget, if anything, would mean that economic activity would be slightly weaker, but there would be a boost in the short term.
What's implicit in the budget is the view that it's fine to borrow to invest or to tackle an emergency, even if it means a much bigger budget deficit in the short term. A point made many times by economists on the left is now accepted by a Conservative Chancellor. Andy Verity, BBC News.
Well, our economics editor Faisal Islam is here. Faisal, what does the budget and indeed the interest rate cut tell us about this administration's thinking on tackling coronavirus?
We have both the Treasury and the Bank of England firing their big guns because of coronavirus. They're trying, the Bank of England at least, cutting interest rates to a record low, 325 years, also tweaking the plumbing of the banking system in order to get the banks to carry on lending, even if firms don't have, their business sort of falls down, their staff have to go and self-isolate, to keep that going because they assume it will be temporary. And the idea is to stop a temporary shock having permanent economic scars. But there's lots of uncertainty around just how long the health emergency will last and the economic response too.
So lots and lots of spending, but, is there anything left in the tank if we need it later in the year?
So now, instead of in previous budgets, the deficit sort of basically going down to zero. It is now permanently at 2 to 3% into the future. That is a risk. That is not fixing the roof while the sun is shining. And when you set that against the possibility that the coronavirus crisis could last longer, the possibility that talks fall apart in the post-Brexit trade talks, there are risks around the corner, and the level of the deficit might not help with those risks. The assumption, the hope, is that interest rates that governments pay stay at these historically low levels for a long time indeed. They will need that to be the case. All right,
Faisal, thank you very much. Well, let's take a look at some of today's other budget announcements. The Chancellor announced £120 million of emergency funding for places affected by this winter's flooding, plus £200 million for longer-term measures. Total investment in flood defences will double to £5.2 billion over the next 6 years. And a new £1 billion fund is being pledged to remove unsafe combustible cladding from all public and private housing blocks higher than 18 metres. The move's been welcomed by the group representing victims of the Grenfell Tower fire. And further education colleges will get an extra £1.8 billion over 5 years to be invested in refurbishment. So there were a number of measures announced today to help businesses deal with the economic consequences of the coronavirus. Alex Forsyth has been getting some reaction from business owners in and around Wolverhampton.
It might look like business as usual, but behind the scenes there's serious worry at this engineering firm. With just 15 staff, if sickness spreads, it could stop production. So there was a close eye on today's budget to see what might help them through. For manager Jeff, loans and help with sick pay is welcome, but this firm won't benefit from a cut in business rates.
Quite disappointed in that, the manufacturing side of things, no business rate relief for us, and I think it would be, it's a relatively simple thing to put in fairly quickly that would help a lot actually.
Overall, were you reassured?
No, there seems to be a very limited amount specifically for manufacturing.
Nearby, this tea room, though, does stand to benefit. And here, the Chancellor's measures were welcome news, as they've already seen a drop in trade.
I think it's fantastic that he's addressed it. It definitely needed addressing. Business rates relief is very helpful.
But even with support, manager Katie is worried about the long term for businesses like hers.
40% down in the last 2 days. That's a big drop in takings. When you lose the high street and you lose your local places where you can go and have a cup of tea, then you lose your community.
Wolverhampton's the kind of place the government's promised investment and attention, an area where 2 out of 3 local constituencies turned from Labour to the Tories last year. This budget was meant to focus on election promises, and there was talk of money spending on road, rail, housing and broadband in places like this. But the Chancellor was forced to confront the economic threat of coronavirus. And for many now, that is the crucial test for this government.
Hello, Lighthouse, can I help you?
For this independent cinema and arts venue, the response is vital. As a charity, they've struggled with funding and can't afford visitors to stay away. They're hoping they can apply for loans and support with sick pay announced today. They need cash flow.
Support has to come through very quickly. It can't just be, oh, well, let's see how it goes and we'll see if you're eligible and we can support you down the line. We need action now.
What are your biggest worries about what might happen in the next few weeks and months?
Well, my biggest worry is that it will be a terminal situation for organisations like us.
For now, the show goes on, and the hope there'll be enough continued support to keep it that way. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Wolverhampton.
Now, the cost of a pint of beer and prices at the petrol pump are always keenly watched on Budget Day. How have they been affected? Well, fuel duty's been frozen for another year. The rate remains at 58p a litre for petrol and diesel. £2.5 billion has also been freed up to fix potholes and resurface roads in England over the next 5 years. There'll be no hike on duty to alcoholic drinks, with tax rises on beer and spirits scrapped. But smoking is about to get more expensive, with 27p added to a packet of 20 cigarettes and the cost of a pack of hand-rolling tobacco up by 67p. And VAT on digital publications, including newspapers, books and academic journals, are to be scrapped from December. Authors and writers have welcomed the announcement. And you can find out how the budget will affect you with our budget calculator. It's on our website, bbc.co.uk/budget, and of course on the BBC's News app.